Okay, starting off today's show, I actually want to talk about a team that is usually in the news, but I haven't really heard their name in the news that much. And I actually heard their name in the news for the first time in a while last night after recruit Khristian Lander announced that he will be reclassifying and joining Indiana for the 2020-2021 season. And a lot of people have asked my opinion over the years. Zach, what's your take on Indiana? What's your take on Archie Miller? Do you think he should be under pressure going into 2021? And what do you think this Indiana team is going to look like heading into this upcoming season? And there's a lot of interesting things that I want to get into with this. And the first thing is this. I understand that there are a lot of Indiana fans out there that don't like Archie Miller. And I'm not saying he's done a great job since he's gotten to Indiana. Like, as a matter of fact, I think when you compare his hire getting to Indiana to Ohio State's hire of Chris Holtmann from Butler, you compare those two hires, they were made in the same offseason, and obviously both teams are in the same league, so that comparison is going to be made a lot. I think that when you compare it, you can definitely make the argument that Chris Holtmann has been the better hire so far. But I do think sometimes Archie Miller does get treated a little bit unfairly by Indiana fans. And Archie Miller is entering his fourth season as the head coach of Indiana, and I totally understand why Indiana fans don't like him. The season where Romeo Langford came in, they just really weren't good. They had that historic losing streak. And even though they were on the crisp of the NCAA tournament because of how many big-time opponents they beat during the season, they still weren't able to make it due to the fact that they just had so many losses. And going into last year, the pressure was definitely on. I think Indiana had no excuse not to be a tournament team last year. And here's the thing. Even though it didn't go perfect, last year, Indiana would have been an NCAA tournament team if the season and NCAA tournament did finish and concur. And Indiana last year, once again, very up and down. They were inconsistent. They had some losses and some games where they didn't even show up. But at the same time, there was nothing on Indiana's resume last year that made you think, okay, this is not a tournament team. They had a big-time non-conference win over Florida State. They had a nice win over UConn at Madison Square Garden. And even though they played in tough Big Ten, they still found a way to have enough wins to make the NCAA tournament. And they really didn't have any bad losses. And the key term here is this, is that they had a 20-12 overall record. Even though their conference record was only 9-11, they did have plenty of wins to get them into the big dance. Florida State, a win over Ohio State at home. How about a win over Michigan State at home? How about a win against Iowa? How about a win at Minnesota? A win at home against Penn State, and even another win against Minnesota. So I really like the way this Indiana team finished their season. And the thing is about this Indiana team, and which is why the commitment is so interesting of the kid Khristian Lander, is that Indiana hasn't really had a star. And that's the interesting thing when I look at this roster that I see. I think if Trayce Jackson-Davis does come back to school, and he actually did announce he is coming back to school, I'm sorry. I think Indiana could be solid next year. And if they bring in a lineup and they put out a starting lineup of the following, they will probably go Rob Finney as a guard. Justin Smith will be back, so he'll be in the starting lineup. Al Durham will be back. He'll be in the starting lineup. Trayce Jackson-Davis back in the starting lineup. And then Devontae Green graduates. They could either go Joey Brunk again. That's kind of the bigger lineup they leaned towards playing last year. Or the guy I like is Jerome Hunter. But the bottom line is, they could play Lander as well. Archie Miller should not be under that much pressure by Indiana fans. Has he been perfect since he's taken over the Indiana Hoosier coaching job? No. But at the same time, I think Indiana fans have to not alter their expectations, but they have to realize we're not playing in 1978 anymore. This is 2020. And for a lot of people my age, they don't realize the history and the impact that Indiana basketball used to have. Do I know that when Indiana basketball is good and when they're buzzing, how crazy college basketball could get and how good it gets? And do I also know that Indiana has probably one of the 3 or 4 most passionate fan bases in all of college basketball? Yes, but at the same time, I do think they have been a little bit harder on their coach because he just hasn't been that bad. In his first year, Indiana just wasn't any good. Tom Crean left that program in shambles. And even though they didn't make the NCAA tournament or anything crazy, I do think Archie Miller did close that season on a good note, and they were at least competitive. 2 seasons ago, 2018-2019, Absolutely no excuses. There was no reason why they shouldn't have been an NCAA tournament team. But at the same time, as weird as this may sound, I think a bunch of that responsibility falls on Romeo Langford. I think he was the main reason why Indiana and the players around him didn't get any better. He was kind of just a ball hog, and unfortunately, there wasn't really anything Indiana could do about it. I didn't love the way their team played last 2 seasons ago. But what I also will say is this. Last year, once again, Archie Miller did kind of prove me wrong. He did lead his team to an NCAA tournament appearance, assuming the NCAA tournament would have happened. Now, this year for Indiana, am I going to want to see them be a little better? Absolutely. If I was an Indiana fan, my goal for the end of the season would be not only an NCAA tournament appearance, but a top 25 appearance. That's how much, if I was an Indiana fan, I would believe in this team. Because once again, they were that last year, and they're bringing back basically every key part of their roster besides Devontae Green, but they do bring in a big-time player in Khristian Lander. And we all know historically, Indiana fans sometimes have had some unrealistic expectations going into seasons. But I think right now that should be Indiana fans' main goal. Start in the preseason top 25 and then end in the preseason top 25 and maybe make a deep run into the NCAA tournament. But when I look at this Hoosier team, this is a 5-star point guard they're getting in Khristian Lander, and he pushed Indiana's recruiting class to the top 15 overall, and this is going to provide Archie Miller with a really good complement freshman to an experienced roster. And I think a lot of times when you ask me, okay, Zach, what exactly is the formula in order to build a winner in college basketball in terms of the balance of veteran and young players? And I've said it a bunch of times. If you bring in a team and you bring back a team full of experienced guys, you don't really have to have a star in that group, but just a group of experienced guys that have played together before, along with a commitment of a big freshman that's very talented, that's the proper formula in my eyes in order to build a successful winner in 2020-2021 college basketball. And I think what Archie Miller and Indiana is doing with this recruit is a really good step in that direction. You bring in Lander and pair him with your guys like Finney, like Justin Smith, like Al Durham, like Trace Jackson Davis, and I think you're not that far off to building a winner. Indiana is returning 8 of their 9 scores from a tournament team in 2020. That should be enough to give Indiana to compete at the top of the Big Ten standings, and it should be enough for them to finish in the top 25. If Indiana does miss the NCAA tournament this season, I will understand why fans will be upset with Archie Miller. And there's no doubt fans should be upset with Archie Miller if this team doesn't reach the NCAA tournament in 2020. They're very talented, and there's no excuse and there's no reason for them not to. But until that day happens, until it is confirmed that Indiana has a disappointing 2020-2021 season, I think their fans need to do a little bit less of a job criticizing Archie Miller, because Indiana hasn't been as bad as everyone has made it out to be since Archie Miller was hired as their head coach. I understand Indiana fans, they expect a lot, and they have a very good history and they've won championships. But Indiana basketball hasn't been on that level really in the past 15 years. But Archie Miller is working his best to get them back on that level, and I think this season they're not that far off. Indiana, if Archie Miller wants to impress fans, lead Indiana to the Sweet 16. Lead them to the Elite 8. I don't think they're that far off, but I'm going to say this. I'm going to say 2 statements. I will say that Archie Miller is treated unfairly by Indiana fans because they criticize him a lot, and he hasn't done as bad as a job as those fans made it out to be. But at the same time, what I also will say is this. If Archie Miller wants to prove to Indiana fans that, okay, no doubt about it, I'm definitely your guy, this Indiana team and this roster that he built this season is talented enough to go on a deep run in the NCAA tournament. If they think, if Archie Miller wants to prove to fans that, okay, I'm your guy, and even though you're criticizing me, I want to be the coach of the future, and I want you to really believe in me and have confidence in me, I want to see Archie Miller lead Indiana to the Sweet 16 or maybe even the round of 32 or just something, at least a successful season in the NCAA tournament, because Indiana hasn't really been down that path in a while. And I think I liked the Archie Miller hire when it was first made. This is a guy that obviously did great work during his time in Dayton, but Indiana's a different animal, man. It's obviously a job where expectations are very high, but I'm going to give him credit for building a nice roster. I'm going to give him credit for the coaching job he did last year, it could have been very easy for that team to fall out of control, especially when they had some low points, which I feel like with every Indiana team, they always do. But going into 2020, 2021, I just like the way this roster is constructed.